I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, your co-host as always.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I'm here on this podcast to sell you not a $300 course on deconstruction, but a $500 course on deconstruction.
Nice. Where can I get me one of those?
Oh, you just go down to your nearest deconstruction store and you'll find it there on the shelf.
I did go to grad school, so I paid more than $500 to take probably more than one class on deconstruction, so the joke's on me.
That's a good point. If you went to grad school, you've done it already, probably. Probably not. Honestly, you need to do a deconstruction of a different kind if you went to grad school, but that's another story. All right, folks, that's right. We're talking about deconstruction this week. And you know what? I'm here to say it's probably good. It's fine. You should be thinking deeply about all of the weird things in your life, because why wouldn't you? I think that's a good impulse to follow.
Mm-hmm.
But not all deconstructionists are probably good. This week we're going to take a second and think about the interesting culture behind deconstruction, and especially with sort of like the trend of grifters that might be prevalent in this particular way of thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. There's the guy from Hawk Nelson. There's the guy from I Kissed Dating Goodbye. There's guys from all kinds of things that you probably know who are on the grift of deconstruction. And I think Matt and I have talked about doing this episode a bunch of times, and we kept not doing it for all kinds of reasons, maybe some good and some bad. I think it is something to kind of tread lightly around, but also something you can't really avoid. Deconstruction as a term has been memeified, for better and for worse, perhaps, in evangelical kinds of conversations. And yeah, I don't know, I guess, Matt, would you say, let me ask you this to start this conversation off. Would you say that you have deconstructed your faith? Is that language you would use?
No, it's not language I would use at all. Though I probably have done that kind of thing. I think
Yeah.
Whatever people mean by that word, I'm pretty sure I have done it. But I feel like I was going through some of that before the wave of deconstruction happened. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like this is a term that has only started being used after maybe I've done some of this kind of thinking.
Yeah.
Would you say that you have?
I don't know.
A very honest moment, some raw audio here.
That's
Dean,
right.
have you deconstructed your own faith?
That's a great question. I don't know. I was talking to my wife about it a little bit, and I don't know what I would say. It's like, I guess it's the same thing where you were saying, like, maybe I have, in so far as I was going through some of the same thought patterns or trying to ask similar questions about my own life in the same way that everybody does when you're growing up and trying to figure out, especially if you have an evangelical moment in your past, trying to figure out what the heck that whole thing did to you and is still doing to you. So in that sense, like, yes, I've spent time thinking very critically about evangelicalism in my life and how it shaped me as a human being and so on. But yeah, deconstruction wasn't the language that was available at the time. So I guess I don't feel like I've deconstructed my faith in maybe just in the kind of way that we talk about it today, but maybe I have. I don't really know.
Yeah. Like, I don't want to become a grifter here myself,
Yeah.
but I do feel like there was a moment in my undergrad where I did kind of come to an understanding that, like, your religion is what you make of it, and it can be, as diverse or not as you would like, as you want it to be. There's this one moment I remember. I was in like a freshman philosophy course, and we read we read Saint Anselm and talked about the ontological argument for God's existence, and I was having a really hard time squaring that particular argument with the idea of hell because God
Mm.
has to be good, right? And anyways, I remember that being like a big moment for me where I was like, oh, well, if I agree with Anselm, then I guess that's kind of a problem for evangelicalism, huh?
Mhm.
And I did. So, anyways, all that to say, I remember like going through a lot of this and kind of coming to the realization that you can kind of like pick and choose a lot of different things when it comes to your own religion and kind of see how they work. And I guess that's deconstructive in a way, but yeah, I would have never called it that.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What's one what's one like book that in retrospect is cringy to have pushed you along the road to where you are now out of evangelicalism, but also like you wouldn't be where you are today without that book?
Yeah, such a bummer. I hate this. Um, James K. A. Smith, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? That's
Nice.
the book.
That's all right. Mine is Clark Pinnock's book, A Wideness in God's Mercy, which is also a universalism book.
Oh, what's that? Shoot. Brian McLaren had a book about universalism too. That was a big deal for me.
Mm.
And I can't remember the name of the book, but I remember reading it and thinking, whoa, what a book. Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe maybe we're up there. We're amongst the the Abraham Pipers of the world, deconstructing ourselves and our own beliefs. And I think you're right to tread lightly around this because I think that is, I mean, I don't know. It's not something you should write off. I mean, like, people should figure out what they believe. That's a legitimately good thing. And the more you think about it, I don't know, not the better it is, but maybe the more the more anxious about it you are, and I guess more anal about it. And I guess that's fine too. But it has become this kind of weird culture industry within evangelicalism and exvangelialism. And as two people who do have a podcast who are very invested in learning about evangelicalism and all of the weird ways that it works, thinking about exvangelialism and the framework of deconstruction seems like something that we, I don't know, kind of can't just ignore, right? Like, it seems like it's a part of the story. It is, I mean, very much a reaction to the strong conservative evangelicalism that that at least like the elder millennials grew up with.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. And I think that's also the I don't know, the reason for some of the treading lightly bit as well, because I think evangelicalism did and still does damage a lot of folks in really particular and unique ways. And I think at its very best, like, the discourse around deconstruction is trying to name that and like process it in ways that are collective, and just being willing to kind of share those experiences and so on. Like, I think at the healthiest, that's what is good. But like you said, Matt, there's this kind of culture industry that has sprung up as well. And I think in some ways, at least with the worst offenders, to me, it almost feels like smuggling in a lot of the really bad structural habits of evangelicalism back in through the back door or something, and being like, well, you got out of a certain vocabulary, but some of the mechanisms are actually still there in some weird ways. So I think it's worth kind of seeing it as this weird, emerging, ambiguous and ambivalent phenomenon, at least.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's exactly the kind of impulse that I think I myself am always very nervous about, and I'm sure other people end up finding themselves being nervous about this too. Like, you're trying so hard to figure out what exactly evangelicalism has like done to you, or what kind of like patterns of thought you kind of just end up picking up because that's what you were given, right? And you don't know any better. But it's always really nerve-wracking to think that like you might be subconsciously reproducing some of the worst parts of evangelicalism without really knowing it.
Mhm.
I think about that a lot in my own life, and it's a troubling thought. So anyways, it's worth considering all of this though, to think about, like, I don't know, how do you do deconstruction in a way that is in a, I don't know, it's beyond all the grifters, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I thought,
Before we
oh, go ahead.
get further, one thing that we should do is maybe explain what we're even talking about, because it occurs to me now. I feel like we're entering the conversation in the middle just by virtue of having that kind of experience close by to us. But I would bet there's a handful of listeners who have no idea what's happening in this subculture or what this term even is. So, Matt, if you had to explain this to somebody who is a happy Roman Catholic who had no baggage with evangelicalism, how would you explain it to them?
Yeah, how would I? That's a great question. So I think, okay, maybe we can start here. Unfortunately, for all of the big Derrida fans that listen to this podcast, we're not talking about that type of deconstruction, unfortunately. Though we are kind of in a very, very tangential sort of way. So maybe this is one place to start talking about what deconstruction is in this particular frame of reference. Christian theology, I'm sorry, that's not even right. Evangelical theology and lots of like mainline theologians had this like very weird infatuation with postmodernism in like the early aughts, and I mean after that and before that too, but it's complicated. And I think a lot of that language of postmodernism ends up kind of like leaching into the larger Christian culture and into like larger, I don't know, just like Christian vocabulary for better and for worse. And I think it's mostly for worse, probably. But I think that is where a lot of the phrasing and vocabulary of deconstructing comes from, is from postmodern theology. I mean, Derrida, specifically Jacques Derrida, a French theologian. Nope, a French philosopher who comes up with this idea of deconstruction that is actually very complicated. And I mean, from Derrida, the idea of deconstruction is that you're supposed to be like taking apart foundational ideas and like I mean the book that always sticks with me about Derrida is called The Force of Law, and the idea is that like at a certain point the idea of justice and law, two ideas that you think are, you know, they go together really well, actually become really at odds with one another. So there's like a big rabbit hole to get sucked into with Derrida and like French philosophy, and you should do it. It's fun. It's great.
You know, I'm
yeah.
derailing you right now because I'm finding myself sucked into it already. And it's just, as you were saying that, I think bringing out Derrida like that, I'm gonna do my very best to avoid getting a slick too theory brained here. But I think as you were talking, it kind of just reminded me of what we were just saying about not feeling like we're part of maybe this wave of deconstruction, but still trying to figure that out. Because one thing I really like about Derrida is he has this kind of famous idea that deconstruction isn't really something that you do. It's just like a thing that happens. Like it happens whether you do it or not. And so, yes, you can take up a kind of intentional relationship to it, I guess. And, you know, Derrida wants you to, like he's trying to do that. But also he's saying it's just going to occur. And I think that's how I feel. I feel like it just happened to me. Like I didn't go looking to do it. It just sort of like, I don't know, was part of the course of being a person in the world. So anyway, all that to say, Derrida is very helpful. Derrida's deconstruction is really good.
It is really good. You're right. It's good, and it does just happen. It's sort of something that happens like when you're reading, and words. I mean, language is all very complicated. This is kind of where it's all coming from with Derrida, though. He's questioning like the big ideas, you know, about language, about friendship, about law, about justice, all these kinds of cool things that we think are like obvious on their face, but Derrida shows that actually they're not very obvious. They're quite complicated, and to pin them down is actually kind of impossible. You try as you might, go for it. But and there's some traces, which is very funny in a Derridian sense, of that type of deconstruction in what's happening with exvangelicism and evangelicalism. I mean, I think that when it comes to deconstruction, it has to do with like questioning the things that are like givens in one's own faith. And I mean, I haven't been like, I'm not like a scholar of this particular type of literature, though it'd be very interesting to get more into it. But I've been reading all these accounts over the past weeks and listening to a few podcasts about this, about deconstruction, kind of just listening to the way that people talk about it and like what this might mean to them. And I mean, I think for most people, this has to do with not necessarily like taking apart an idea linguistically or something, or thinking about the logical underpinnings of something, but it has more to do with like, what are the big things within one's own expression of religion that you might have doubt in. And then like, you know, what does that doubt do? Like, what happens if you doubt this thing or questioning this thing, or what happens if you just don't want this at all? What happens to you if you shove it out of your life? And like, if you are a person who is not religious in the slightest, that might seem like, well, no big deal. I mean, you just decide, you don't want things all the time, and it's fine. But I guess like in evangelicalism, the things that you're questioning are like, the most foundational things in your life, that like God exists, or that I don't know, Jesus resurrected or something. Like these are like supposed to be foundational things, and to suddenly shove them out of your life can leave these huge gaps and chasms, and like what do you do in their absence, right? And like deconstruction is kind of about figuring out what to do with those things, like when you don't believe them, or when you want to believe them in a different way, or whatever. So I think a lot of these conversations end up having to do with doubt and faith, and kind of their particular arrangement around core normative beliefs within Christianity. Um, yeah, so a lot of times people express that in terms of like, does hell exist? That ends up being a big one for people. It was a big thing
Hmm.
for me.
Hmm.
I don't know, man. Are you gonna go to hell? It's a big deal. um, anyways, yeah, I think another place where this kind of comes in, though, in a really, I mean, a way where again you'd want to tread lightly in like discussing, because of the profound damage it does to people. But it comes from figuring out what to do with like purity culture, or
Yeah.
evangelicalism's like inability to deal with the existence of LGBTQ people, right? Like these beliefs about like human sexuality are, I think, a place where Christianity warps people's brains in particularly troubling ways. And to maybe, I don't know, maybe you come to a new understanding about yourself, and you find that you are gay or something, or you're trans or whatever. Like grappling with that, and also like the things that you've been taught and kind of come to believe deeply about purity culture, can be like a really traumatic situation for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. It's also evangelicalism is so hard to process because it is such a totalizing idea. Like, I don't know, I've said this on the podcast a handful of times, I guess, but for people who don't know, I grew up Roman Catholic. My parents sent me to Catholic school and everything else. And then I had like a long detour through evangelicalism in my adolescence. And the weird thing about that kind of life is like most of my evangelical friends also came from evangelical homes, right? So like their parents were, true believers and so on. My parents were like pretty average Catholics, which is to say, like, not very, like, not worried about it. We went to mass, but I don't know, if we slept in, it was fine. And what that experience gave me, I think, is this sort of like lived experience of being a child and knowing what it's like to not have religion be the totalizing thing in your world. So it's like, I don't know, Pokemon was, I guess, probably the totalizing thing in my world for a while, like not questions of my eternal destiny, even though I went to Catholic school. But when I became an evangelical, it was like that piece, the Christianity piece, sort of got bigger and bigger until it sort of consumed everything else, right? And I think it was easier for me to get out because I didn't have that same family formation.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see, like, even with my own kind of experience being a sort of truncated one in evangelicalism, it is so successful at turning you into a particular kind of person because it demands like your full attention and the kind of full policing of your personhood in the world that
Mhm.
like you can't really even once you start pulling little threads, whether it's your own sexuality or relating to people of different sexualities or gender identity and so on. Once you start pulling those threads, like the whole thing threatens to unravel in this really scary way. And I think that process, it like it sends you on a course to be like, either I want to unravel it all at once and kind of see what happens, or like I'm gonna very sort of anxiously unravel as much as I can, as slowly as I can, and kind of keep discovering what's left to be unraveled. So I think I've been through both of those moments, maybe different times in my life. But yeah, it's hard to communicate how totalizing that experience can be.
Yeah, you use the phrase communicate, and I think that's like really actually an important part of it too. Um, is some of the tension in deconstruction comes from the inability to like, like once you kind of start doing that work and kind of processing it all, it does become very difficult to communicate with people who you might have had very close relationships with before, whether it's like a family member or a friend or whatever. Like there's an idea that really rings true to me from the work of Stuart Hall, who is a cultural theorist and a communication theorist, from like the sort of British Marxist school. And he has this particular model of communication that's riffing off of this other. It doesn't matter. It's like a lot of a lot of grad school bullshit. I guess what I'm trying to say. Anyways, part of it though is that communication, something that makes communication difficult, is that when the people engaged in the act of communication have different what he calls frameworks of knowledge. I think that ends up being a pretty big deal, especially when it comes to the process of deconstruction,
Yeah.
or then like the working backwards of like maintaining a relationship with somebody who's not in the same spot as you. I have this like very I don't know, this pretty vivid memory of being like a teen, not a teen, but like being home from college and like talking to my mom about religion or whatever. And I tell her whatever I was learning in like, a religion class, or like I took a class in New Testament or something. I was really excited about it. And she was like, "Well, do you think that like do you still have a personal relationship with Jesus?" And I was like, honestly, that's not even a word that it doesn't even make sense to me. Like that as a concept isn't something that even I think like registers with me. I don't know what it really would even mean to do that. And like that made her obviously upset because like that's not what your mom just say yes. It's not lying necessarily if it's true. Um, but like anyways, what I'm trying to say is that framework of knowledge is no longer like there on my end, and it was
Mhm.
there on her end, right? So we're kind of talking past one another. But that's because like, I started doing that work of like processing like what I thought was true about the world, or what was true about religion, or how I wanted to engage with it. So that like drastically changed the way I was capable of talking. It sort of
Mhm.
limited conversation in some ways.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think that's a great way to get things on the table. Maybe that's one way too of just articulating what at least I think is kind of I don't even want to say like the good version of deconstruction or the healthy version or whatever. I think my own process doesn't feel very healthy when I just look back
I agree.
in
Yes.
retrospect. But nevertheless, I guess it's the way of articulating the deconstruction that happens to you, at least. That like you don't have to go looking for it. It will just sort of occur the more you kind of attend to all the weird stuff that's going on in your life and the contradictions that you encounter in the world. But maybe, Matt, we can pivot to differentiate that a little bit from what's going on with some of the kind of grifting folks in the deconstruction culture industry.
Yeah. Well, I want to be a little bit okay, the theme of this episode is treading lightly when we're talking about other people's spirituality, because like we don't know what's going on for them, I
Yeah,
guess.
totally.
But I was listening, I was doing as much research you could on this kind of topic and what research looks like for this particular niche of the world is just like listening to people's weird podcasts, which is fine. I'm here for it, I guess. Um so I was listening to man, I can't remember which one it was now. So one of these like sort of exvangelical podcasts, and I was kind of interested in it because John Steingard, who is the lead singer from Hawk Nelson, was on it. And man, let's see. Hawk Nelson is a pop punk band from the I don't know, the 2000s, the early 2000s. I saw them at Cornerstone a handful of times, and I didn't particularly like them, but this is interesting, I guess. Like, what's this dude up to these days in 2021? um, so John Steingard, he's again, like I said, the lead singer of Hawk Nelson, and he was on this podcast because recently I didn't even know about it. But he went through like a strangely public process of like deconstruction. That's the word that he used for it specifically. So there we go. It was all kind of just like stemming from his doubts. And he kind of said a lot of interesting things about it though. He said that at the beginning of COVID, he started feeling this way
Hmm.
because COVID gave him a moment to kind of like slow down and actually think about his life, which is really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that's probably the story for a lot of people. Actually, you like can't go to church, you kind of cut off from your communities, and all of a sudden you're having some big existential conversation with yourself. Anyways, so he was talking about his own sort of process of deconstruction, and this is what he said. I'm not saying, sorry, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that John Steingard is like a grifter or something. He's just a guy that's talking about it
Yeah, yeah.
publicly. But it kind of gets us into the culture of celebrity deconstruction or something, and that to me is a fascinating thing. Anyways, so on deconstruction, he says this: if God is real, then he set up reality in a way that allows for that uncertainty. If he's real and he created us, he made the universe, and he left the possibility of his lack of existence open. He left that open, and to me, the idea of a loving God and a loving Father who leaves that possibility open yet condemns people to hell if they don't figure it out right away. I just really struggle with that because it doesn't feel like a loving thing for a father to do. Okay, I'm reading this just to give some like flavor text of like what these people are going through kind of in public. And I think it's just like really fascinating. It's like such a wild thing because like, um, man, I am glad that nobody gave me a podcast when I was like 19 years old and I was just like thinking about Anselm and the ontological argument or something. That would have been bad. I gotta say, I don't feel sorry for him. I mean, like, there's no pity. It's just like what a weird thing to like have to kind of process this sort of thing out in the open. I don't think that's particularly healthy, but who am I to judge, I guess. But anyways, I think that this is a really interesting, and first of all, it's just interesting to hear the way people talk about it, but it's also like illustrative of the ways that Christian celebrities or Christian pseudo celebrities, I don't know how much of Hawk Nelson qualifies you to be a celebrity, but it's like really interesting to see that like, you know, that I think there's this feeling that maybe since these people had some type of status in an evangelical world, they kind of have to explain themselves now or something. But that is just to me a super interesting phenomenon. These people had some kind of status, they were sort of famous or whatever, and now they feel like they have to kind of go through this publicly.
Yeah, or at least like a person of influence in an extremely niche totalizing community, right? Like a person of standing in evangelicalism or adjacent to it. You can kind of understand why maybe this is how what I was saying earlier, deconstruction sometimes smuggles in those weird habits of evangelicalism through the back door. It's like you shouldn't actually have to justify how you feel to like a whole community of strangers, but like actually that's what evangelicalism wants you to do so bad, right? To constantly like testify about your deepest, innermost secrets, even if they're not really authentic, whatever kind of feels I don't know, affective to you in that moment. It's kind of incumbent on you to like broadcast that in this weird way. Like it's you kind of get conscripted into being vulnerable all the time if you're an evangelical, I think. Yeah, I guess like you said, Matt, I don't know what's going on with John Steingard. Maybe he doesn't feel that way, and I hope he doesn't, because it's a terrible way to feel. But like it's a pattern that happens in evangelicalism, and I guess it makes sense to me to kind of watch emergent church or evangelical influencers, you might say, kind of processing all this stuff in public. Like he's one among so many other examples of folks who've kind of been maybe just doing this in better or worse ways in the last 5 years, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you're right about this smuggling evangelicalism out of evangelicalism and sort of like reliving it. I mean, again, I don't want to say that that's what he's doing, but you could see the tendency for sure to be publicly vulnerable, to have to feel like you're accountable to a group of people who, like, now you're saying don't have authority over your life anymore, but you need to like make it clear, which is very interesting. There's also kind of like this element of confession to it. Okay, anyways, I don't want to like psychoanalyze this dude because it's like whatever, I don't know him at all. But yeah, the element of celebrity to this whole thing seems important. Okay, here's someone who I will judge a little more harshly. His name is Joshua Harris. Listen, if you are a happy Roman Catholic who's never thought about evangelicalism a day in your life, Joshua Harris is someone who you don't know for sure. But I'm going to tell you about him. So if you're a millennial exvangelical, you know exactly who Joshua Harris is. He's a guy who wrote a book called "I Kiss Dating Goodbye." And let's see, Dean, did you ever read this book?
Did you read it?
Oh yeah,
I never read it.
Oh my god, I read it for sure. It talks about a church camp, engaged with this in so many different ways. And here's the thing. Dating is bad. According to
I've heard that.
I mean, okay, first of all, I have to agree. It's not great. I don't like I mean, going on a date is fine because I'm like a married person and it's a whole different sort of dynamic. But being 16 and going on a date is probably one of the worst experiences anyone's ever had. Or maybe that's just me. I don't know. I don't want to project myself out into other people. But anyways, dating is bad is one of the things. It it puts you in all kinds of situations where you're very likely to sin. You're gonna lust after somebody, you'll have you'll do premarital sex, whatever, all these kinds of things. So Joshua Harris is like, okay, so if it's bad, if dating is even if it's bad, if it could cause you to sin, then you should probably just like not do it. Okay. How then, you might ask yourself, would you find a significant other in your life? And Joshua Harris says, well, you would do it by developing a relationship called courtship, where it's like this like very puritanical sort of like way to date somebody.
You send a messenger pigeon to your prospective suitor and hope for the best.
That's right. You you get your 10 best lads to send her a fantastic arrangement of birds and trees and all kinds of other things. Just like a very sort of distant relationship that you'd have with this person. And in this period of courtship, you're not supposed to kiss, and that's a big thing. That's a big part of it too. Okay, so this is all, I mean, this whole book, I'm laughing about it now because it's like so kind of absurd, but it had a pretty central role in the purity culture of like the, I guess, early 2000s. And people tried to live that way, if you can believe it. So anyways, that's Joshua Harris. That's the book he wrote. He had another book too. And years later, he kind of came out and said, you know, I regret writing this book. And every Christian teen that read it was like, me too, my friend. But you know, the damage had been done, I guess. Anyways, recently he announced that he was no longer a Christian and he was kind of on this path of deconstruction and kind of figuring out what all this kind of stuff means. And I mean, good for him. On the other hand, I'm like mad at him. He did a lot of damage to people, and I don't feel good about that. Anyways, this is a quote from Joshua Harris about his situation. He says, by all the measurements that I have for defining a Christian, I am not a Christian. Many people tell me there's a different way to practice faith, and I want to remain open to this, but I am not there now. So he says that in this kind of like you know, this way that has some kind of opening to it, where maybe he could be a person of faith again or whatever, but right now he's not. But in the wake of his announcement about his, you know, the path of deconstruction, about not being a Christian, whatever all this might mean, he also, this is like the very tasteless part of it all. He launched an online course called the Deconstruction Starter Pack that cost $275 to people to take. So it's like an online class that you would take and an ebook. And this book in the class, it provides a quote step-by-step process to reframe and reimagine your human journey. Additionally, on top of all that, Joshua Harris announced that he'd also give the course away for free to people who are harmed by purity culture, sort of in the honor system. The funniest part about this, okay, it's funny and it's sad all at the same time, but the funny part is that he's giving it away via like promotional code that he'll give you.
I kiss Josh hello.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's part of the celebrity. I have more about Joshua Harris. I'll let me read this one more quote and then I'll stop for your take, Dean. Joshua Harris says this: I was brought up in a Christian faith. When community and family built on faith can be beautiful, but difficult if you're shifting and changing in your thinking. I want to be open to returning to the faith if possible, but it's important for me to know that I can step away and make that choice to step away. So that's kind of his feelings about deconstruction, that he wants to know that like he doesn't have to be a Christian if he doesn't want to, that totalizing force in his life, he could shun it if he chose. And that's a good feeling. But also, man, could you have not done this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, it's like I hadn't heard of Josh. Like, I knew of that book and I knew of Joshua Harris back when it mattered and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I never read the book, but I think that was because I felt I also didn't need to, because like everybody around me had kind of communicated what was going on in that book to me directly and indirectly. And I think that, you know, like once I left evangelicalism, I probably never thought about that guy ever again, I guess. And I think my big thought when I saw the deconstruction stuff going around is like, you know, who's asking for this? Like, who is like, where's this guy been and how can I get my hands on, I don't know, that journey? And I think, you know, like you said, Matt, if he is sincerely kind of trying to work out, you know, the way that his own brain is messed up by evangelicalism, like, good for him. We should all do that. And, you know, I wish him the best in that effort. But I think it's also important to realize that, like, one other way that evangelicalism gets smuggled in lots of other ways is by kind of praising, like, the figure of the kind of influencer character, or like, I don't know, the Oracle pastor grifter, the pastor entrepreneur who kind of can lead you in a training to, live your best life now and so on. And it kind of felt to me like that's what Joshua Harris is doing, right? That like by using the language of deconstruction, he's kind of slowly just becoming the evangelical influencer he was before, but like with a better brand or a more appropriate brand now. And I don't know, it's like sometimes, everybody should be able to be reconciled to their community. Like I'm a prison abolitionist and so on for sure. But at the same time, it's like that doesn't necessarily mean that you then become a person of influence in that community again. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, to me, it's bizarre to kind of say, to turn the process of deconstruction that happens naturally into some kind of money-making scheme or something like that.
Yeah, it's hard not to be extremely cynical about the whole thing and see it as,
Yeah.
one big and unfortunate capitalist grift.
Hmm.
But I think you're exactly right. I mean, part of evangelicalism that I think that doesn't get enough focus is that particular role of, yeah, like pastor entrepreneur. I think that is like such an important piece of the puzzle. And I mean, people talk about it and they've written about it, but like I feel like sometimes, you think of you can't think of evangelical churches just like any other church. It is like a speaking event, specifically for a particular person
Yeah.
to like create a platform for them. Um okay, this is perhaps a tangent, but I think it's worth saying. So in like getting into some of this like very interesting and troubling exvangelical reaction, I did start listening to this podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church, which I think I'm late to the game on. I think that I missed I missed the big wave when people were listening to it. But it is a very interesting artifact that is I think actually a really good it's an artifact that you can't really explain to anybody without the context of evangelicalism and exvangelialism. So um, if you've never heard of this podcast, I promise this does get back around to the point of evangelical entrepreneurship or something. But it is a podcast about just what like happened at the Mars Hill Church, the church that Mark Driscoll was the pastor of. We have an episode, episode 69, about Mark Driscoll called Biblical Porn with Jessica Johnson that does rule. So go listen to that if you want to. It's a long time ago though. Anyway, so this podcast is kind of doing this like serial but about a church podcast, trying to get to the bottom of like what happened at Mars Hill. Why is Mark Driscoll so bad? Like what did he do? And it is really fascinating because it does shed a lot of light on this particular arrangement of pastor as influencer. I think that's really fascinating. And I mean, like, not only is Mark Driscoll this kind of person, but this is just like, I think the role that many sort of like evangelical megachurch pastors find themselves in. That, church is like, it's, well, of course they're going to say it's about a community and you got to go to your core group and whatever. But really it is about a dude having a speaking event one time a week. And like, kind of creating a whole culture around that one particular person. Which is a really interesting development itself. The podcast is narrated and kind of hosted by this guy named Mike Cosper, who is he's a Christianity Today person. And a minute ago I said it's a podcast that's hard to kind of talk about without the context of evangelicalism, evangelicalism. And it is so fascinating because it is a podcast that is dealing with, I think, a lot of the themes that people who are interested in evangelical communities now are like really want to see people who are Christians deal with, right? Like people who are kind of like leaving evangelicalism and kind of deconstructing their faith. They want to see evangelicals like really dealing with the problems that are inherent within their communities and their cultures, like the like misogyny, like the mistreatment of women, like the inequality of women, the inequality of LGBTQ people, all these kinds of things. And this podcast does show, it does demonstrate a little bit of like how evangelicals kind of are grappling with the problems latent in their churches, right? At the same time, it does a whole lot of apologetics for evangelicalism. No matter like how awful the story is that they tell about Mark Driscoll, like, there's this one episode about complementarianism and about Mark Driscoll's particular view about women. And it's awful. It's like really vile. I think Mark Driscoll's whole culture within his church is completely awful. But it's wild because like the host of the show will be like, he'll always editorialize at the end of the podcast and be like, well, it's really bad. Mark Driscoll's kind of a scumbag, but you gotta know though that God does show up, anywhere, despite who the pastor is. And it's like, get real, dude. It's like, anyways, the podcast is I think running a lot of interference for the particular sins of evangelicalism. But just the same, still widely popular among, I think, people who are kind of doing this process of deconstruction, because it's taking a look at something that, has had a huge impact on their life. All that to say, Mark Driscoll is a really good example of the the evangelical sort of like influencer as pastor, and boy, is it a bonkers construction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think saying all this stuff on this podcast is like obviously casting stones from a pretty shiny glass house for sure.
Yeah, of
and
course.
like, yeah, like I'll be the first to admit, like the reason I have a podcast, right? The reason I do a lot of things in my life is because I was an evangelical, and you kind of get these diseases that are just going to be there forever, like feeling, I don't know, some completely misguided sense that you have something worth saying that other people might want to listen to, right? Like that is like an evangelical disease for sure. That I hope I've managed to at least like turn into something productive and not as toxic as it once was. But nevertheless, like I think we're all always kind of wrestling with the ways that evangelicalism has shaped us, and in some ways for the better. Like I think we've talked about this in the podcast before too, but like the reason that I am a person who's very invested in whatever social justice and having being able to have a very weird kind of fringe political ideology and all that kind of stuff, that is all also from evangelicalism, as much as I hate to admit it. But I think it's just that process of deconstruction is so hard too, because if you're not at least trying to be, I don't know, alive to those hazards, you're gonna just sort of repeat them in different forms. And I think that's the story of Christianity too, in so many ways. Like basically having these kind of violences underneath that keep bubbling up in different disguises over and over, because they just don't get named, or they get repackaged. And man, evangelicalism is just extremely good at doing exactly that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, I don't mean to exclude ourselves from this whole from the whole
No, of course,
influencer
yeah.
industrial complex. I suppose though there probably is some kind of difference between starting a church and telling people how to live their lives, and then telling people about like
Yeah.
communism on a podcast or whatever. But
We're not Josh Harris. I feel comfortable saying
that's
that.
true. There are definitely, okay, that's a good way to put it. There are degrees to which we are bad, and that's not the worst degree.
Yeah. You, dear listener, can decide exactly where on the chart of bad we belong. But keep it to yourself.
There's a chart of like smiley faces to frowny face. You just point to which one we are.
Yeah, that's right. And again, don't tell us where we are. Just point it
for yourself, of course. Yeah, this is an internal practice. Yeah. Well, okay. But I think that's the interesting point though, is like how I think that, again, I'll reiterate this, like figuring out what you believe and like letting go of bad stuff and like figuring out how to let go of bad stuff is great. I think it's a great practice. The tough thing is just like, man, being sure that you're really doing it, how do you really know that you're like letting go of these things? I mean, that even uttering those words, how do you know you're really doing it, is such an evangelical anxiety in itself, which I guess is fine. But it's like you can only do so much. You can only like self-hew away so much of like who you are and like what you've become. And to a certain extent, there's like some things that are going to be very difficult to kind of get rid of, and kinds of thought patterns that you might want to rid yourself of. It's hard to figure it out. Part of the conversation though that we should kind of turn to now that we're close to the end of the hour, which we might even be. No, we have still time. It's great. Is there's deconstruction, but then some deconstruction folks in the exvangelical sphere talk about the idea of reconstruction as well. And I think that's really fascinating. Is like you've taken apart whatever these beliefs are. You're thinking really hard about them, and maybe there's some that you can't get to, and you maybe never will, and you'll have to deal with that. The other part that I think is really interesting is the opposite. You know, you put yourself back together, or maybe you don't, or you try not to at least. I was listening to an episode of Dirty Rotten Church Kids, I think is what it's called. A podcast I am actually growing pretty fond of. But they were there's an episode that they had from kind of a while back where they're talking about deconstruction and reconstruction, and as they put it, you know, you don't have to reconstruct if you don't want to. You could just like not. And by that, I think they meant like if you kind of do this work of deconstruction and you just end up like jettisoning a lot of these like Christian ideas, like it's okay. You don't have to like pick them back up or like, you know, you don't have to like leave
Mm.
evangelicalism and become like an Episcopalian or something. Like I think it's kind of like what
Mhm.
they're saying. But I was thinking a little bit about that, about like how you do like, I mean, if you're not, you know, you do all this work to be very intentional about like taking these ideas apart. But if you're not just as intentional as putting them back together, I think that ends up causing some other interesting problems.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so. Well, it's also y- here's another great tip from Jacques Derrida, everyone's favorite real deconstructionist. He not that the other deconstructionists are fake ones, just he's the, you know, he made a whole life thinking really hard about it. He has a really interesting observation about deconstruction where he says basically the gist is like anytime you're deconstructing something, you're also reconstructing it, even if you don't really know that's what you're doing, or even if it's not intentional. So in a weird way, both of these things can be subconscious. Like I mentioned earlier, deconstruction is something that happens to you. Reconstruction is that way too. And I think what Derrida is getting at is so fascinating because it's like yeah, you can take everything apart, right? Take your whole faith apart or whatever. But when you're doing that, you're going to be doing that with like tools that you got from somewhere, or you're going to be sort of taking them apart, and in that process, you'll be sort of, you know, contributing to a new version of yourself. And Derrida's whole advice, I think, is always to sort of be like as aware or like as mindful of these kinds of things as you can be, to kind of stay vigilant about them. Not in like an evangelical way where you're constantly on guard or whatever, but more in a way that's like, you know, not naive, I guess, about thinking that you can kind of just take everything apart and then sort of always be in the negative or something. And I think for me, for a long time, I felt like that's what I wanted to do, like just kind of keep saying no to everything because I had so much anxiety about sort of rebuilding a big totalizing force to take over the other one. But I think over time, the best thing that ever happened to me specifically, this is not advice, just confession. The best thing that happened to me was going back to the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is so bizarre and like plural and weird that it's like, well, this could never be a totalizing thing in the way that evangelicalism was. And I can just kind of be a Catholic and sort of forget about it, you know, like just sort of adopt that as a part of myself and construct that identity on purpose without it being a totalizing one. So I think just that sort of attention to the fact that you're always going to be reconstructing and you can do that on purpose in better or worse ways is a good gift, at least that I got from Derrida, thinking through what it means to kind of take apart very formative pieces of your life.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Since we're throwing around French philosophers, I'm going to do it too. Some people that I mentioned last week, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, they have this particular way of talking about this exact problem in a book they wrote called Anti-Oedipus. Um, and when they talk about it, man, who knows what they're talking about? They're French. It's impossible to know. But they have this particular way of thinking about the organization of desires, I guess, and how they kind of produce different desires. Desires producing desires, man. That's what it's all about. Anyways, so they have this way of talking about it called de-territorialization. It's like where you are finding these things in your life and you're kind of, you know, you're stripping them away. You're you know, all of the hang-ups that you have, all of like the weird little like niches in your body of like weird belief that you have, you're smoothing them all out, right? You're getting rid of them, you're deconstructing. It's in this way of thinking. But there's also they also say that you can't deterritorialize without also reterritorializing at the same time. That like, yeah, just like what you're saying, you can't take it all apart and not also like put something in its place. I mean, it's like it's sort of this like weird philosophical problem of transformation, of becoming something different, is that like,
Mhm.
you can be one thing, a Christian say, and you can become an atheist, but you have to like have a way from getting from point A to point B, and the way that you do that might really matter, right? I don't know.
Mhm,
I've
mhm.
known a few Christians in my life who've become like very turned on by like new atheism, and they're swapping out one type of totalizing desire for another one that I think is probably just as problematic and bad as the last. So it does like really matter what we're using to think through these things. It strikes me as like the I'm thinking here of Mark Driscoll again, particularly, but in the
Mhm.
Mars Hill podcast, there's this point where they're talking about I don't know, some kind of like transformation of faith in Mark Driscoll's life, where he goes from being just like a regular evangelical kind of guy to being this like hyper masculine one. And the interesting thing is that he's like, he wants to eschew all cultural value, and only adhere to like really conservative and sort of like masculine values. And it's just like this such an interesting thing that's like this transformation for him. It was like, I want to eschew cultural values, but actually he just like ends up kind of like accepting a bunch of them that are really normative, like having a
Mhm,
heterosexual
mhm.
marriage and like, being like masculine in this one particular way. And it seems like such a like silly and naive thing to do, that you're like looking for this true faith, this true type of Christianity and this true social ethic. But like you go through it all, and really what you have at the end is something that's like just reactionary. And I mean,
Mhm.
in the case of Mark Driscoll, it's like annoying and problematic and toxic and also incredibly violent for all the people that were in his church. But for people deconstructing, it's like it's something to be very mindful of, because you don't want to just recreate the problems that you already have, or recreate the thoughts you already have, or like just as bad, like, I don't know, pick up a bunch of beliefs that end up, I don't know, just not are nothing, right? Like deconstructing from being an evangelical Christian and then just becoming like a great moderate Democrat would be such a weird move, right? Like you have
Mhm.
this like transformative moment in your life, and then like what do you do with it? Is just like you become like, I don't know, a Joe Manchin fan or whatever.
Well, this is the thing, though. I mean, you the thing that bothers me the most about some ways that deconstruction gets memeified is it really cheapens the process in a way that is like, okay, you'll deconstruct everything about, your Christianity or spirituality, but where you land is this set of other kinds of violent ways of being in
Yeah.
the world that you sort of take as an achievement, and in a relative sense, they probably are an achievement, right? Like I don't know, if you grew up in a household that was a diehard like George W. Bush evangelical household, and now you, I don't know, like really liked Pete Buttigieg or something like that. That's sure. There's a lot of like important relative distance between those 2 points. But if you stay as like a Pete Buttigieg person, and you kind of refuse to deconstruct, and I think a lot of people do that, like they kind of land in that moderate space, and then they refuse to ask more critical questions about that. I think that sort of choice to stay there is, it it is not worth the it's not worth all the trauma of like extricating yourself out of it if you're just going to end up kind of living another violently patterned life in that particular way. I mean, we're all, none of us are free from violence, but like if you kind of land in that naivete and then double down on it, like, I won't mention these people who they are, I guess, on Twitter or whatever, but I don't know, we've tweeted about them before or something. Like, there are sort of Christian influencers out there, right, for whom deconstruction is a way of like avoiding things like politics, or saying, I'm neither left nor
Yeah.
right, right? I've deconstructed these binaries. I don't really believe that they're meaningful categories for me, or, I'm not a Christian in this particular way, but I am in another one. But that ends up making people kind of like supersessionist or colonialist or whatever it might be. It's like, if you use deconstruction as a way to actually avoid asking those really hard questions, I think for me that's where I'm like, oh, like I really don't want to be associated with that at all.
Yeah, that's right. This is probably the thing that we are the worst at talking about, honestly. Like, if this was a history about like, I don't know, Christian communists in some country, we'd be all about it. But like talking about someone else's spiritual transformation, or like how do you change your life and like live a different way is like a very tough thing to figure out. I mean, for anybody. But I think that you're onto something, that like if the transformation is really transformative, you want to like I don't know, keep questioning things until you get somewhere even deeper, you know. That does actually deal with you know, not just binaries in this like sort of cheap deconstruction, but really attends to I don't know, material reality and the politics of it all. It's important. And yeah, it is a bummer if people kind of just like stop too soon.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know, I think if you're going to make deconstruction your brand, this is how I'll put it. If you're going to make it into your brand, that's fine. Probably there's room for a few people to have that be their brand, and they can probably be genuinely useful in the world, and so on and so forth. I'm willing to imagine that in my brain. But if that brand doesn't then kind of deconstruct things like capitalism and liberalism and colonialism and all these other kinds of things, that brand of being a deconstructionist is, you know, basically not that different from being a pastorpreneur or whatever it might be. I think that is just something to be sort of vigilant about.
It's true. If you're not a socialist at the end of the day, we're not gonna say that you're good on this podcast. That's for sure.
I mean, you know, well, I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, Matt, but I've had people who have said, well, of course you're, you know, a radical socialist or communist or whatever, because you were an evangelical, so you've always been a bit of a zealot and so on. And like, probably that's true. Like, it's not wrong, but at the same time, it's like, you know, those things are not necessarily the bad things about evangelicalism per se at like a structural level, right? So it's also important to kind of just think through our allergies and what we're allergic to in that past, and what kind of discipline that was imposed on us through evangelicalism or other forms of Christianity can be repurposed or re-territorialized or something into some other kind of machine for liberation or whatever.
I didn't quite expect to get here in this at the end of this episode, but we're very much at we've arrived at the Lacanian enjoy your symptom kind of moment. Like, listen, yeah, evangelicalism did some very weird things to the way you think, and I guess now you got to make the best of it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can never be rid of it, so all you can do is find a way to like it. That's a
there might be something to that though, right? The zealotry of evangelicalism, if you can transform that into the zealotry for justice or something, I don't know, man, you could do worse. Enjoy that symptom.
Yeah, totally. Well, there you have it. I don't know. Deconstruct your faith. Don't deconstruct your faith. Let it happen to you. I don't know. I've no good advice at the end, but I will say, whatever you do, you better not
That's
like
it.
capitalism.
That's the one thing.
That's my one piece of advice.
How could you?
How could you? It's so bad. It's a bad totalizing thing, and evangelicalism loves it. So if you really want to get rid of your evangelicalism, you're going to have to become an anti-capitalist. That's what I'll say. That's my hot take at the end.
Deconstruct that binary, you ding dong. All right. If you like what you heard, and this one, maybe you didn't. Maybe this one was too much. It could have been. But if you did, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast.
You can build our grift.
Our pastorpreneur podcast. Okay. If you do support us there, you do get I feel like too bad about the grift now. I don't even want to say it. But you should support us on Patreon, but I'm not going to tell you what's over there on the other side of that wall. You have to go look and see yourself. Cool. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have